Hey everyone, it's Dr. Marcon. I just wanted to do a few slides from Chapter 15 on the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is a system of motor neurons. These neurons innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The autonomic nervous system regulates visceral functions. So viscera, again, think of viscera, you think of organs. So visceral functions such as heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, urination. The autonomic nervous system is the general visceral motor division of the peripheral nervous system. So going back to this flow chart showing you the different parts of the nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So peripheral nervous system, you have your sensory afferent division and your motor efferent division. Okay, so you have signals going towards the CNS and signals coming from the CNS. So we can see that within the motor efferent division, we have our somatic nervous system and our ANS, or somatic motor system. Or visceral motor system, excuse me. So the autonomic nervous system is then further divided into two divisions. We have the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. The somatic motor system, when we compare it to the autonomic nervous system, we know that we have one motor neuron that will extend from the central nervous system to skeletal muscle. These axons are well myelinated and they conduct impulses rapidly. However, within the autonomic nervous system, it consists of a chain of two motor neurons. You have a preganglionic neuron and then a postganglionic neuron. Now, conduction is slower than the somatic nervous system because the axons within the autonomic nervous system are thinly myelinated or non-myelinated. We also know that the motor neuron synapses in a ganglion. So this figure in your book, figure 15.2, actually is a comparison between the somatic motor and autonomic innervation. Somatic motor and autonomic innervations differ anatomically in two major ways. First, the target organs that are innervated. Somatic motor, they target skeletal muscles. Whereas the autonomic innervation, they target smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Okay. Another way that these two differ is the number of neurons in the pathway. The somatic motor only has a one neuron pathway, whereas the autonomic innervation has a two neuron pathway, which we talked about, the preganglionic, postganglionic neuron, and they synapse in an autonomic ganglion. Okay, so that is how somatic motor and autonomic innervation kind of differs. And you can kind of read this out. You can see that with somatic motor, you only have that one neuron, whereas the different divisions of the autonomic nervous system, you'll have two neurons. And, you know, they also differ in the neurotransmitters that are used in the postganglionic neuron. So we talked about the divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We have the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Again, they are made up of chains of two motor neurons and innervate mostly the same structures. However, we know that they cause the opposite effects. So the sympathetic division mobilizes the body during extreme situations. This is our fight or flight response. So extreme situations including fear, rage, exercise. Whereas the parasympathetic division controls routine maintenance functions. Think rest and digest. So again, sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight responses activated during extreme situations. Think the three E's: exercise, excitement, emergencies, maybe there's a fourth E, exams. You want to either take it or you want to run away from it, but you're going to have to take it anyways. So again, under extreme situations. All sympathetic responses help us respond to dangerous situations. So It prepares our body for that fight or flight response by increasing heart rate and breathing rate so we can get more oxygen to our tissues in case we need to run away. So increase blood and oxygen to skeletal muscles. Also vasoconstriction of other blood vessels. So for example, we don't want our blood running to our digestive organs. We want them going towards our skeletal muscles or things that will help us run away from a situation, a dangerous situation. Also helps dilate pupils and bronchioles, inhibits motility of the digestive tract and the urinary tracts, because honestly we don't need them while we're trying to run away from a big, bad, scary dinosaur or professor of anatomy. The parasympathetic division is active when the body is at rest. It is mostly concerned with conserving energy and helps direct the housekeeping activities of the body, such as digestion and then elimination of feces and urine. Again, buzzwords for the parasympathetic division are rest and digest. So heart rate, blood pressure, respiration are at low normal levels. So for example, I give this example for my physio students. You're sitting there and maybe you're hooked up to a machine that is monitoring your heart rate. You're sitting there resting, just breathing in, chilling out, studying, when all of a sudden the fire alarm goes. And you can actually notice a big jump of your heart rate from normal resting, which is anywhere between 60 to 100 beats per minute, to maybe 110, 115. In order for that to happen, basically, you have to decrease your parasympathetic inputs, and then you have your sympathetic nervous system kicking in. Okay, so you can't have both of them going off at once. You have to have a decrease in parasympathetic and then an increase in sympathetic to show increased heart rate. And this is actually a really great overview of the subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. So I would definitely take a look at figure 15.3. So we know that parasympathetic responsible for our rest and digest. So we have stimulatory effects going to our stomach, our pancreas, gallbladder, bladder, and then, salivary glands, as well as to the eye, where it helps constrict the pupil, so decreasing the amount of light that's going into our visual cortex so that, it doesn't keep us awake, helps us, go to sleep or rest if we need to. So providing stimulation to the digestive organs as well. Whereas we can see in the sympathetic division, it is giving stimulatory effects to our lungs, our heart, increasing heart rate, liver, so that we can process more sugar in the time of need, adrenal glands to help secrete our epinephrine to increase our heart rate. So we can see that sympathetic, again, stimulating these areas that help us with that fight or flight response. Now, the divisions of the autonomic nervous system issue from different regions of the CNS. So sympathetic is also called the thoracolumbar division, because that's where we see our sympathetic fibers originating from, whereas parasympathetic is called the craniosacral division, because we see our parasympathetic fibers coming from the cranial region as well as the sacral region. And we can kind of compare the two divisions based on certain parameters, such as, for example, the length of post-ganglionic fibers. With the sympathetic nervous system, we have long post-ganglionic fibers because the stimulus has to go a longer distance. Whereas with parasympathetic fibers, we have short post-ganglionic fibers because they don't have very far to go. Branching fibers with sympathetic fibers are highly branched because they influence many organs at once, whereas parasympathetic fibers, very few branches because, again, you'll have that localized effect. Also, the different neurotransmitters that are released by the postganglionic neurons. Within the sympathetic postganglionic neuron, they release, most of them release norepinephrine, which will then bind to your adrenergic receptors. With parasympathetic, the postganglionic axon will release acetylcholine, binding to cholinergic receptors. And the next table is very important because it kind of gives you the differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic division, both anatomical and physiological differences. So we have different characteristics such as origin, location of ganglia, neurotransmitters. So I would definitely take a look at table 15.1 and read it over. So with the parasympathetic division, it's also known as the craniosacral division because with the cranial outflow, it will originate from the brain and innervate organs of the head, neck, thorax, and abdomen. And with the sacral outflow, you have innervation that will supply the remaining abdominal and pelvic organs. Okay, and here you can see innervation of the different parts, different outflow of the parasympathetic nervous system. From the cranial outflow to the sacral outflow and the visceral organs, as well as the reproductive organs that are innervated. I'm not going to talk too much about the preganglionic fibers of the parasympathetic outflow. I do want to talk about the vagus nerve. So vagus nerve is cranial nerve 10. The vagus nerve is very important because the fibers of the vagus nerve will innervate visceral organs, so of the thorax, and most of the abdomen. So the vagus nerve will stimulate digestion, reduction in heart rate, and reduction in blood pressure. Preganglionic cell bodies are located in the dorsal motor nucleus in the medulla, whereas postganglionic neurons will be confined within the walls of the organs being innervated, and then cell bodies will then form an intramural ganglia. So the vagus nerve will send branches through autonomic nerve plexuses, such as the cardiac plexus, the pulmonary plexus, esophageal plexus, celiac plexus, and superior mesenteric plexus. Okay, I'm not going to concern myself too much with this figure of the path of the vagus nerve. So we know the vagus nerve originating here, and then having its innervations down to the organs within the thorax and abdomen. Sacral outflow just innervates organs of the pelvis and lower abdomen. So that's all I really need you to know about that. Sympathetic division supplies visceral organs in internal body cavities and structures of superficial body regions. Preganglionic fibers form the lateral gray horn, and it does contain more ganglia than the parasympathetic division because the sympathetic division is actually a lot more complex compared to the parasympathetic division. And mostly because it innervates more organs. So it supplies not only all the visceral organs in the internal body cavities, but also all the visceral structures in the superficial regions of the body, such as the sweat glands, the hair-raising erector pili muscles that we saw under the microscope when we were looking at skin, especially skin of the scalp. And then the smooth musculature in the walls of all the arteries and veins. So it's kind of easy to remember that the sympathetic nervous system innervates these structures alone. We know that, when you sweat under stress, your hair stands up when you're terrified, and your blood pressure skyrockets because of vasoconstriction when you get excited. Okay, so these are all things due to the sympathetic division. The parasympathetic division does not innervate sweat glands, erector pili, or most blood vessels, with some minor exceptions. Kind of going through this part, not really a need to know. So again, sympathetic pathways innervate sweat glands, erector pili muscles, peripheral blood vessels. So, for example, when you are taking a practical exam, your sympathetic nervous system kicks in. You might be sweating under pressure. When you're terrified, like there's a ghost in the room, or you find out late that you might have more work for this semester, which you don't, but that could cause the erector pili muscles to have your hair stand up on end. And then also will increase blood pressure by vasoconstriction of your peripheral blood vessels. So I'm just actually going to go through this. So what you need to know for pathways to thoracic organs, we know that sympathetic fibers to the heart have a less direct route. Functions of sympathetic fibers of the heart include increasing heart rates, and then when sympathetic fibers go to the lung, they dilate bronchioles, allowing for more oxygen to enter the lung, will dilate blood vessels to the heart wall, and meanwhile inhibit muscles and glands in the esophagus and digestive system. Okay, and here is just a really nice picture of the sympathetic division of the ANS and the different glands that are innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. So, maybe just take a look at 15.8. There's actually a really great table that shows you all the different organs and the what divisions innervate those organs. You don't have to memorize them, but it's a good to know. We know that the adrenal medulla, so the adrenal glands are the glands that sit on top of the kidneys, also known as the suprarenal glands. And within the adrenal glands, you have different layers that will secrete different hormones. So within the medulla, which is that inner layer of the adrenal gland, you have the secretion of norepinephrine and epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. These are stimulated to secrete by preganglionic sympathetic fibers. Okay, so it's under the control of the sympathetic division, so that you have a secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine, again, responsible for our fight or flight response. So the adrenal gland is a major organ of the sympathetic nervous system. And here we see the innervation by the sympathetic nervous system to the adrenal medulla, allowing for the secretion of epinephrine, norepinephrine, which will then travel from the capillaries to the bloodstream. And again, table 15.2, just so you can compare the effects of the parasympathetic nervous system versus the sympathetic nervous system. I wouldn't, focus too much on this. I mean, know that, with sympathetic, you have your fight or flight. So you want sympathetic innervation to increase heart rate, increase vasodilation within the lungs to allow for more oxygen, and all that stuff. So have the general idea of what the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system does. Parasympathetic, rest and digest, so stimulates the abdominal organs, specifically the digestive organs, whereas sympathetic effects would have a negative or inhibitory effect on the digestive system, because you don't need to be digesting food while you run away from a big scary dinosaur. You just don't. So definitely, read up on 15.2 just to get a general sense of what both divisions do. I'm not going to go into visceral sensory neurons. What I do want to go over, just a little bit about visceral reflexes. We talked about reflexes before. We have visceral sensory and autonomic neurons that participate in our visceral reflex arcs, such as the defecation reflex, which we talked about during GI, as well as the urination or micturition reflex when we talked about the urinary system. Some are simple spinal reflexes, while others don't really involve the CNS and are strictly peripheral reflexes. And then we talked about the 5 different components of a reflex, and we can actually see them here in our visceral reflex. Okay? And then we have our baroreceptor reflex, which basically we have chemoreceptors that pick up any changes in blood pressure. And, here is the pathway. So, for example, we have an increase in blood pressure. We have baroreceptors in the carotid sinus, which are stimulated, which will then send sensory impulses on the visceral sensory fibers. And then it goes to the integration center within the medulla oblongata. From there, you'll have a motor response efferent pathway via the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, then going and providing parasympathetic stimulation of the heart, which will then decrease heart rate to allow for a reduction in blood pressure. Okay. We know that the autonomic nervous system is not under direct voluntary control. We do have activities that are actually regulated by the central nervous system via the brainstem, the spinal cord, the hypothalamus, the amygdaloid body, as well as the cerebral cortex. And we can see that here in this slide. So we have communications from the CNS, cerebral cortex and the frontal lobe, which communicates at the subconscious level with our emotional brain, our limbic system, which also has communication with the hypothalamus. And we know that the hypothalamus is the boss, the overall integration center of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, and then sending communications to the brainstem as well as the spinal cord, where we have reflexes for urination, defecation, erection, and ejaculation. So autonomic nervous system is controlled by the brainstem and spinal cord. We know that the reticular formation exerts most direct influence. We have the medulla oblongata as well as the periaqueductal gray matter. With regards to the hypothalamus and amygdala, the hypothalamus is the main integration center of the autonomic nervous system. That's something you definitely should know. We have our medial and anterior parts of the hypothalamus, which will direct parasympathetic functions, whereas the lateral and posterior parts will direct sympathetic functions. And then we have the amygdaloid body, which is the main limbic region for emotions. And this is important because people can exert some control over their autonomic functions. For example, during meditation, we can enhance feelings of calm. When you are in Shavasana during yoga, is it Shavasana or whatever, you're lying down on the ground like a corpse pose, whatever it's called, you can enhance feelings of calm and just melt in the floor. And this is due to the influence of the cerebral cortex on parasympathetic centers in the hypothalamus. Also, we have a voluntary sympathetic response, such as recalling scary events or things that happen to you. And you notice how when you're telling a really scary or, exciting story, your heart rate starts pumping, you start sweating, and all of a sudden eliciting those sympathetic responses. So that's all I'm going to talk about with regards to the autonomic nervous system in Chapter 15. So that will be your last lecture video for the semester. I hope you enjoyed Dr. Marcon's lecture series, and good luck on the exam.